Folks are back. I'd like to introduce Tatiana Chaterji, who is a refugee youth summer enrichment alumna, and will be guiding us through a reflection on healing justice. She is an educator, trainer, and restorative justice practitioner working at the borders of criminalization, intergenerational trauma, structural violence, and youth empowerment. With over a decade of experience in schools, prisons, reentry, juvenile justice, and community settings, she brings a deep commitment to peace building, violence prevention, and healing. In the United States, we grow up accustomed to punitive structures and systems that are harmful to our growth and well-being. We hope to interrogate the normalization of those practices in our discussions and reflect on how we can change those practices. Tatiana, thank you for being with us here today and offering this much-needed space.
Thank you, everyone. You all can hear me? And yeah, it's an honor and privilege to be here. PBHA was a safe space away from the elitism of Harvard, which I feel like I'm allergic to. And actually any alumni event that I've participated in has been a PBHA one. And class of '08, part of RISE and RIGHT. I was in the building a lot for different organizing meetings around student labor and other issues happening in the Boston community. And for today, I am glad to sort of give a little bit of context and grounding for our topics. The topic that will be you all will be discussing with each other in circles. And so I'll share a little bit of knowledge and then invite you all to learn from each other and listen in new and different ways. I guess before starting, so I'm Tatiana Chaterji. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. And I'm based in Oakland, also known as Wichin, which is the unceded land of the Alumni people. And the practice that I'm going to be talking about today, known as restorative justice, was taught to me by practitioners from the Tagish and Tlingit First Nations people in Canada, and is practiced all over the Americas. It's an anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and relational way of looking at the world, of solving problems, of prioritizing connection to each other and healing. And Mia Mingus, who some of you might have heard in yesterday's lecture, is a friend and colleague. I've known her for years, and the work of transformative justice and restorative justice is very interconnected, and shares some very fundamental political principles. But first, and maybe let's do it, we're not on gallery view, but I could just kind of glance at where you are. From a scale of 0 being your fist to 5, how familiar would you say you are with RJ? If I said restorative justice, do you think you know what that is? 5 would be like, yep, pretty confident, how people talk about it. I think I know what that is. 0 is like, nope, never heard of it. 1 might be, I heard of it, but I don't really know. And you could be a 2 or 3 or a 4 or anything. Awesome. So I'm seeing kind of a whole range, a lot of 3s, kind of cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so I guess, you know, the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway to understanding what RJ is that our current system of punishment, of police, and of prisons isn't working. If it were working, then we would be the safest place in the world. I just lost a student last week to violence. I feel like I lose students all the time, or people. I knew this young woman, but even from the 100 and something murders in Oakland this year, I've known probably a handful. And we don't have safety. I worry for myself. I worry for my kids. And if we were approaching things with safety as a value, then we would be looking at things differently. We would be looking at meeting people's basic needs. We would be looking at the impact that all of our actions have on each other, because we are in community and relationship to each other, but our systems like to separate us. I experienced violence shortly after when I graduated. I got the stride right. I was working in Dorchester in the Haitian community. I was back in the Bay Area and actually hanging out with some other PBHA friends. And I was attacked probably a mistaken identity. I had a brain injury and I was in a coma. The PBHA community was so supportive. And when I woke up, because I don't have myself a background of street violence, or really, I grew up with a lot of privilege. But I encountered in that moment how disposable my life was. And really any of our lives can be. And the police didn't investigate, and my need to connect around what happened and to have healing was completely disregarded. People encouraged me to, first of all, just stay quiet. And my own voice was taken over by, my parents talking about the issue, or whoever else wanted to talk about the issue. And my own experience of the violence and violation didn't come into the picture. It was only when I was invited into restorative justice that my story could take a center seat, and it could take a center seat in a way that was authentic to me, and had space for both the ways that I might want revenge, very dirty, sick, sort of twisted revenge, and also knowing that that's not my best self, that isn't everything that I am and want to be, and how to feed the love and the understanding and compassion that keeps me grounded. So I've had the privilege of being able to sit in circles with people who have done similar kinds of violence and crime and hear their story and listen to their humanity. I've experienced their apology or their feelings of regret and understanding around the impact of violence. And I've been able to listen and really embrace what it means to live in poverty or have neglect, have trauma, how the cycles of trauma enact in such a way that allow us to dehumanize each other. That is kind of in a bigger, more life or death scenario of how RJ can be different than our criminal system. If I were able to know who had attacked me, I wouldn't be allowed to talk to him. Or her or them. I wouldn't be allowed to do that because there's a separation between victim and offender that our criminal legal system sets up. There's a binary, there's often assumptions made about each of those categories of people. And more often than not, we know our offender. More often, in my instance, I didn't, but more often than not, we know who's hurting each other. And the fact that our legal system would put that line, put that prison wall, or whatever it might be to separate us, really is illogical in my frame, right? There's one thing that could be safety and distancing yourself from an aggressor, and there's another thing in creating false separations and also not honoring the multiple victimizations that are happening. I understand that everyone I've spoken to who's been criminalized is also a victim of crime, of some actual crime, and their victim role is not acknowledged in our legal system. And I don't want to talk about the whole victim rights movement because I could go on a whole thing there. I wanted to ground it in another example, working in an elementary school. The sort of standard procedure when a kid was misbehaving was to deprive them of their minutes at recess. Sort of there had to be a consequence for whatever kind of misbehavior was going on. It could be hitting other kids, it could be bullying, it could be disrespectful language. And so we had kids by the end of the school year who had racked up hundreds of minutes because you didn't have to pay it off right away. You could pay off, they would tell the teacher at recess, oh, I want to pay off 1 minute, or I want to pay off 2 minutes today. And so then by the end of the year, it's sort of unfathomable amount of minutes for them to be able to pay off. And at the same time, these kids are the ones that need to get their energy out and run around to be focused and present in the classroom. So I had a very supportive staff and administrator at that school, and we were like, okay, how do we do this differently? This recess, taking away recess is not working, and we don't want the impact of individual kids' actions to be neglected. We don't want to be neglectful. We don't want to be permissive around what's going on. So we put a lot of time into thinking around this, and we gathered different people from the faculty and the community to be mentors to these kids, who walked with them and sort of talked through things, had them help clean up in different parts of the campus. So there was sort of an authentic community service element that was happening. We also were able to do a series of bullying circles where individuals who had done harm were kids. These are children, right? They were put into multiple circles with victims with their victims, right? Or the people who had been targeted and feeling like they had been made fun of. And I'm so inspired by the bravery of those particular children to be like, yeah, I want to talk about this. These are all the people who have hurt me. And we did little circles and we all talked about how we'd been bullied. Every single person, right? And a lot of them were the quote unquote bullies. And at a certain point in the circle, you could tell that there was this realization like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. Like I bullied, but I'm also a bully, or I had that experience, right? I am actually the person who's sitting across from me, even though we're so different. And so in order for that to actually happen, we needed an enormous amount of resources, which we didn't have, but we tried our best. And the commitment to doing something different than what's normal, what's the standard procedure, right? It takes a lot. It's a lot more creative imagination to get out of the standard process of how you deal with things. And so this cultural paradigm shift of really thinking differently and being okay with this idea that empathy is the thing that keeps us human, that makes us human. It's the way forward, and you can't force empathy. You can't force someone to actually care that they did something that hurt someone else. So we learn together, we train, and it's a muscle that we keep flexing on how to feel that empathy for someone who looks differently than us, who comes from a different background, but that nonetheless we can care. And when we care, we don't hurt. When we have that trust, we don't hurt. And so that's sort of the preventative piece of RJ. And then how you respond when harm has happened looks like not giving up on the person who's done the harm, not locking them up, throwing away the key and saying that they're sort of, they're irredeemable, or that they made this mistake and therefore we give up, but walking with them. And maybe it's not the victim or the person who's been affected who does that, walking with them, but trying as much as possible to honor their humanity in the midst of it, which is extremely challenging. I'll just share one last story, which is that I have a very close childhood friend and sister who has been experiencing domestic abuse and just sort of psychological, emotional abuse more than physical. I had initially tried to reach out to community members to do a transformative justice process and hold them accountable. And most of the people that I reached out to either didn't want to get involved or they didn't believe me. He had charisma, and I experienced kind of a vicarious gaslighting that she had been experiencing this whole time from him directly and from different elements of the system. So she did go and get a restraining order, and he went and filed a counter restraining order. They went to court. It's been an extremely traumatizing process. The whole thing is not set up to help anyone. And I'm at a stage now where I'm going to try to go back to the drawing board, because I'm glad that she was able to get maybe a little bit of protection, but it's not enough. And the cycles are continuing to happen. And I'm reaching out now. You might have heard Mia Mingus talk about pods, the different people who are in my pod and our overlapping pods with my friend, to think into who can stop the abuse that's happening. Understanding that it's coming from a place of trauma and it still is wrong. It's unacceptable. There's a child's welfare that's at stake. And I don't know what it is. It's taking an enormous toll on me. And it's also taking more time than sort of a police response. And I'm just learning that any number of police reports will also not result in the ideal outcome for anyone. So we're at this juncture in society where people are talking about abolition. They're talking about eliminating police. And I'm here kind of to offer this in a reflection space to what does that mean in your personal life? How are you challenging policing or punishment in your homes, with your kids, at your workplace, with your neighbors? How do you challenge for yourself the, wanting more of a retribution response to when something has gone wrong? When I'm insulted and disrespected, I might want to just burn things up, but where do I go to have a more sustainable and positive sort of ending or outcome? And so you'll be discussing that, and then also maybe you're not really thinking of it, just how you've internalized the more normative, punitive ways of responding to things, and what are you curious about practicing? How could you breathe into these alternatives? Anything that Mia said yesterday, or anything that's coming to mind as I'm speaking about the alternative to police, to punishment, or also to the idea that somebody outside of yourself can actually force you to change, right? Like, I think I ask this question to a lot of my students: do you think that punishment works? Does it make people change? And my answer is that it doesn't make people change. It just makes you more sneaky, so you don't get caught the next time. And that if I want to change, it's got to be because I want to change. Or rather, if I change, it's because I want to. And no one is going to force me to do that. And so how do we set into motion those cycles intrinsically inside of ourselves to make those changes and to care? And let's see, I think I've talked a lot at this point. And I would love for you all to, well, are there any, should I open it up for questions, Maria and Joyce, and then set you off into these groups?
Sure, if you think it'd be helpful, if anybody has any 1 or 2 questions, we'll have time in groups task to speak as well, and maybe at the end, but if there are any clarifying questions, certainly now would be helpful.
And what you can expect is that you will be passed a virtual or metaphorical talking piece, which is a symbol of who has the floor, who gets to share. If you don't have anything to say, you can pass it on. The facilitator will have an order for you, but you are explicitly invited and given that moment to share. And then that order will mostly stay the same for the different discussion rounds.
I don't see any hand raised, so I think we're okay.
Great. I'm